Hey, this is Adam Tomasi from Champion Briefs, and I'll be giving the March-April 2020 topic analysis for Resolved: Predictive Policing is Unjust. So that's a small topic, but it's packed with content. And for more excellent content, I encourage you to check out our evidence brief, where we have hundreds of cards on both sides of the topic, as well as excellent topic analyses written by expert coaches. So I encourage you to check that out again. So to get into the nuts and bolts of this topic, it's worth starting with justice and the notion of predictive policing being unjust. This is important because when we think about justice, there are specific philosophical questions that invites, such as the fair distribution of benefits and burdens in a society, the proper role of punishment, to whom punishment ought to be assigned, how a society ought to be constructed, what sorts of distinctions ought to come into play, who ought to have the authority to make those decisions, and more specifically, what is the role of policing in a just society. Another important meta-level question that this topic invites is that about data and about objectivity. So in a world where artificial intelligence drives more and more of the decisions that are made in a society where we are in the age of the algorithm, so to speak, can this replace quality human decision making? Do algorithms and big data replace human bias with more objective and accurate decision making, or do the algorithms merely confirm the biases of their creators, or create a feedback loop where, because of the biases of, say, police departments using certain software, are reinforced in the biased decisions that they are making? So that's going to be a really important question as well, because it would be easy to say that predictive policing is just a tool and the question is merely one of efficacy, or that this debate is simply about whether predictive policing is inherently just or unjust. But in fact, there are multiple nuances that both the affirmative and negative could explore, where the affirmative could say that predictive policing is unjust as presently constituted within an unjust society, though in theory, you could use big data in a way that's socially responsible. The negative could acknowledge nuance by recognizing that poor communities and Black communities and other people of color have a legitimate complaint about over policing and ongoing police harassment, and that police departments should in fact reform a lot of their unjust practices, but that predictive policing can be useful in that reform effort and also has other external benefits that the affirmative may overlook. So to define predictive policing, the RAND Corporation, which has written an extensive and voluminous study about predictive policing, defines it as the application of analytical techniques, particularly quantitative techniques, to identify promising targets for police intervention and prevent or solve crime. So essentially, predictive policing uses computer software to generate a prediction about the future in regards to where crime is likely to occur, so that's place-based predictive policing, or whom is likely to reoffend if they have a prior criminal record, which is person-based predictive policing. You'll have some articles that'll liken this to the movie Minority Report, in which you had a society with a pre-crime score for every single person, where they were able to project into the future who exactly would commit a crime and at which point, and then attempt to stop and detain people before that could occur. So the ultimate big brother police state. The software involved with predictive policing is not that strong or complex. So while it's not akin to a pre-crime surveillance state, it still does create its own mass surveillance that has potentially problematic implications in terms of digital privacy, in terms of accosting people whom are facing an unwanted search or seizure in violation of their Fourth Amendment rights because they have not been caught committing a crime because there is no reasonable suspicion or probable cause. But then on the flip side, predictive policing as an opportunity to have presence in certain areas by which it may be possible by that presence to prevent crime or to be on the scene more rapidly so that crime does not escalate once it begins to occur. So there are a lot of balancing acts that the topic invites by considering when policing becomes over-policing, and again, whether or not predictive policing helps the role of the police as we would imagine it existing in a just society. So there are multiple different types of predictive policing software, and this is going to be really important when the affirmative and negative talk about the extent that predictions have succeeded or failed in certain cities. And predictions are being used in dozens of cities by multiple police departments all across the country. So the first and most popular is PredPol, which is location-based predictive police, location-based, I should say, as they call it, proactive policing, coming from the company website where they bill this to police departments as they are selling a product, and therefore it is private companies that are the ones that have designed this software in order to make money in the hopes that police departments are convinced that the technology will work. But nonetheless, PredPol explains on their website that they generate red street boxes of 500 by 500 foot squares that are based on a Google Maps interface, and the boxes demarcate areas where the algorithm predicts crime is likely to be committed. And officers are encouraged by the company to spend 6 minutes an hour in the boxes. So they would have to make sure that they metaphorically check off the boxes by patrolling in those areas more than others. And when you look at crime statistics around predictive policing, you may find in some articles that cities found that they had slightly reduced crime in the box areas, but that crime had increased slightly in the areas that were not heavily trafficked due to the prediction software diverting police attention to areas that were hotspots, so to speak. And it's important to note, too, that hotspot analysis is something that police departments have done for decades, and this has especially been done by the New York Police Department with all of their racially fraught practices, such as stop and frisk. But the idea of using human or computer-based analysis to determine that some areas have higher arrest rates, which are then read as a proxy for having more crime, even though there are discrepancies between arrest rates and the true crime rate, but still using this data as a premise by which to put more resources in an area. And that's the situation that creates over-policing. So it is quite possible that predictive policing is effective in certain areas, but to the neglect of others, and that creates a problem for both racial and economic bias, and also creates a problem for practicality. But of course, the negative can look at the details of the software itself and suggest that in fact these problems are unlikely to occur. For example, the company PredPol itself insists that, quote, no demographic, ethnic, or socioeconomic information is ever used. This eliminates the possibility for privacy or civil rights violations seen with other intelligence-led or predictive policing models. So here, PredPol is explicitly distinguishing itself from other predictive policing software, which would make sense because they're a private company and their goal is to sell their product versus others. But they're also speaking to the controversy that has come about around predictive policing, that it violates civil rights, that it is a racist tool, and they insist that their software does not engage in those biases. However, the strongest affirmative argument is that predictive policing acts upon proxies for racist policing, say, by looking at arrest rates instead of, say, 911 calls in an area. And if police are already harassing certain communities and over policing them, those arrest rates are naturally going to be higher. So then they're going to keep going back to those areas because of historic arrest rates. Of course, also, even if you look at if you claim to look at historic crime rates, there may be certain biases that are lingering there, such as in a study from the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, which had used a demo of PredPol along with crime data from Oakland, California. And they found that the software recommended that police deploy officers to neighborhoods with mostly Black residents. And there was also a study by researchers Isaac and Christian Lum that found that PredPol would lead officers to target predominantly Black neighborhoods for drug arrests, even though they were able to map an estimate of drug crime based upon census data and the National Crime Victimization Survey, and they found that estimated drug crime would have taken place in the year 2011 in all sorts of different neighborhoods, including predominantly white ones. Yet PredPol was not telling police to go where drug crime was likely to occur. Rather, they focused on two or three districts in the city that magnified, racially disproportionate arrest patterns, which meant that the algorithm was replicating human bias. And certainly, the negative can argue that PredPol is not guilty of these charges. In fact, one limitation of the studies I described is that the Oakland Police Department does not actually use PredPol, but that the researchers had extrapolated from if the city of Oakland used PredPol, what would occur. Then the negative has two routes with that. Either they can say that, in fact, biased policing will and hotspot analysis, which doesn't require a computer, will continue whether or not we have predictive policing as a method. The second route the negative could take is arguing that, in fact, having some level of data-driven policing can discourage the amount of biased hunches that police who are likely to profile people may have, because their priority may not be to specifically go after certain individuals that they suspect are suspicious, but rather to patrol an area within the box in the hopes that they spot a crime before it escalates. Or at least the negative could say that that's the ambition of the program or a reform that they promise. So there are two other predictive forms of predictive policing software which are important to look at. The second one is HunchLab, which looks at past crime data and other criteria such as geography, date and time, population density, areas with bars, schools, churches, and public transportation, census data, temperature, even moon phases, and the schedules for home games for sports. So this creates a lot more unique sort of predictions than PredPol, because PredPol claims to only look at crime type, location, and the date/time that crimes have been committed before based upon arrest data and reported crimes. But that ignores the true crime rate, as a lot of crime is not reported. But with HunchLab, they're looking at a multiplicity of factors and claiming to predict future crimes by even looking at stuff that seems as ephemeral as temperature or the time at which there's a sports game. Certainly, if there's a home game, more people might be staying home watching TV instead of going out and committing crimes. But the Marshall Project gives examples of the types of predictions that HunchLab has made, such as that physical assaults decreased when Chicago experienced windier days. And they also found that auto theft in Philadelphia had increased if a car was parked next to a school. So the idea here with HunchLab is that a police department may find, for instance in Philadelphia, that auto thefts are more likely if a car is parked near a school. So the data tells them that if they want to prevent somebody's car from getting stolen, they should patrol more often in areas where there's heavy parking by a school, so that they may potentially find somebody that's about to speed away with someone else's car and stop it before it happens, rather than a reactive approach where someone's car gets stolen and then they get a 911 call and then they have to put out a notice about the person's license plate and try to find it that way. However, in terms of the question of arrest data, because I had talked about the self-reinforcing feedback loop and also how PredPol incorporates arrest data rather than the true crime rate. An article for Government Technology by Samantha Melamed insists that HunchLab does not use arrest data, unlike PredPol, and therefore it would not create a feedback loop. So the negative can certainly argue that HunchLab is better than PredPol and that predictive policing is not inherently unjust for that reason. The affirmative can argue that the fact that HunchLab uses all of these multiple complicated factors does not guarantee that police are going to be effective in how they use their resources, because certainly while police, for instance, continue to patrol an area when it's not windy in the hope that assault rates will be higher, and then they're more likely to stop one, may be looking for the wrong clues, and they may be distracting themselves from more ordinary police work in terms of investigating very specific areas where there have been multiple reports, or like the traditional investigative police work that one would expect. There's also another system of predictive policing, the third one I have on my list, called Palantir. This is person-based predictive policing, and it was used both by the New Orleans Police Department and the Los Angeles Police Department. And in New Orleans, the police used it to analyze people's past criminal records, their social media history, as well as their ties to known gang members. And their goal here was to provide counseling services and other social services to people that they would then put on an offender list. So they would determine that certain individuals were likely to reoffend, and then they would have police officers go to them and try to get them into some kind of a program for at-risk youths or others. And the idea there would be that they can stop crime before it allegedly repeats itself. And this was similar to the heat list that the Chicago Police Department used, where they had an algorithm that created a list of people that it targeted as most likely to be involved in or commit a shooting. So with person-based predictive policing, you get a lot more questions around due process and in terms of people's Fourth Amendment rights, because on what basis can you look at someone's social media history, for instance, and then assume that they are more likely to commit a crime? Or if you look at somebody's past criminal record and assume therefore they're likely to recidivate or reoffend, that totally discourages somebody from reintegrating back into society because they're already marked with the scarlet letter of having once been in prison. And Los Angeles used Palantir as well to create chronic offender bulletins and a chronic offender score to locate people with past criminal records in certain areas. And they actually announced to people in the mail if they were being monitored. Though from a due process perspective, one of the major problems was the LAPD was not notifying people if they got taken off the list. So here you might have somebody that was on the list and taken off, but they don't know, and then they constantly feel like they're being watched and targeted by police officers and lose the ability to trust the police or fear that if they report a crime, they themselves might be implicated. However, in August of 2018, LAPD actually stopped using Palantir because of pushback from civil liberties and civil rights groups. And in April of last year, an audit from the state inspector general found that predictive policing was inconsistent and ineffective. And according to the Los Angeles Times, this still means that the department will be using hotspot analysis, but that'll come from human beings doing the work of making their own assessments, one may say predictions, rather than algorithms. And that's another thing too. You could argue that the way that we construe prediction would mean that an affirmative could say that policing should only be reactive, that there should be no guesswork at all in police activity, that it should only be once a crime has already been committed that police come onto the scene. But the fact that there's still human analysis suggests that that wouldn't really be realistic. And either way, both affirmative and negative have to explain how policing ought to occur in a way that is not biased and is not unfair, which is probably the central question of this topic. So in terms of thinking about affirmative and negative positions, which could be constructed without paying too much attention to the individual software types that I have described above, but it is really important to get into the nitty-gritty details of how predictive policing actually operates so that neither side is able to control the framing of the debate by claiming, for instance, that predictive policing violates due process rights, but maybe place-based predictions don't do that in a way that person-based would. Or maybe the negative claims that predictive policing reduces crime, but maybe their statistics do not consider the extent that they are arresting people and then using that arrest data as a proxy for effective police work, when really it's just a feedback loop that perpetuates an unequal system. And in any case, since a lot of crime is not reported, about 50% of it, How can they adequately measure that if their only focus is really on how many crimes do they think they're stopping in areas that are over-policed? But in terms of 3 affirmative and 3 negative positions, the first affirmative position to look at is mass incarceration, which has to do with over-policing and the feedback loop that I described. Unfortunately, one weakness with this affirmative case is that the affirmative is limited in their ability to claim that they change certain other aspects of the criminal justice system. Such as disproportionate sentencing, biased juries, even the algorithms that are used in risk assessment to decide bail decisions, which is occurring in some states that are ending cash bail, yet using risk assessment to decide whether someone is a flight risk. And that might involve proxies for race and class by claiming that a person is from a certain neighborhood and therefore they're likely to reoffend. Or even though the algorithm, they could say like PredPol that they're not explicitly looking at race or ethnicity, that by looking at certain geographies of an area, they are then using race or class as a proxy. The affirmative is limited in their ability to create that systemic change, but we'll have to argue that predictive policing is a centerpiece of these larger trends. The second affirmative to look at is one around due process. So that has to do with individual privacy rights as well as Fourth Amendment rights. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution prohibiting unwanted searches and seizures. So you could argue that predictive policing is inherently unconstitutional. The negative has the opportunity to explain how predictive policing could be made constitutional. And certainly the Supreme Court has made a lot of Fourth Amendment rulings which are really lenient on the decisions that police officers are able to make based upon mere suspicion in a way that is shocking from a justice perspective, but if the affirmative is looking at a strict constitutional perspective, the negative might be able to say that legalistically predictive policing would be just. A third kind of affirmative avenue to look at would be a utilitarian-based position by arguing that predictive policing, in fact, makes public safety worse because crime may disperse to other areas if some places get over-policed. Predictive policing may lead to an overemphasis on focusing on certain offenses to the neglect of others where crime increases. You can even focus on other countries because the resolution doesn't say United States. So you could talk about how China is using predictive policing to fuel its mass detention of Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang province of northern China. And you could argue that the over-policing due to big data that occurs there will embolden violent resistance, and that this may spark larger instability within Asia, of which the literature exists. In terms of 3 negatives, one would be about societal welfare. This is in our brief. Not only would you be able to talk about the extent that predictive policing would reduce violent crime rates or robberies, but also potentially larger national security defining crimes like hacking or terrorism. And you could even focus on predictive policing as an opportunity for the police to get involved in providing social services like the counseling programs that I talked about, or even with the improvement of a city via programs like green spaces. So there was one study that found in our brief that found that in Atlanta, the use of big data with predictive policing software, specifically PredPol, was able to calculate where it would be opportune for the city to create green spaces where you have these like beautiful parks and gardens because of the scientific benefits of those spaces for improving mental health and overall citizen satisfaction, and then reducing the overall crime rate. So you can get creative in terms of arguing how the predictions could be used to prevent crime, rather than supporting a regime where predictive policing currently is used to support stuff like stop and frisk. So there are reform alternatives. There's a whole debate about transparency. So a lot of affirmative literature talks about the fact that predictive policing algorithms tend to be a black box. In other words, communities that are experiencing policing made by those algorithms have no idea what the formula is to decide, for instance, where those red boxes go on Google Maps. So how can the police be held accountable in that scenario? The negative could argue that there are mechanisms by which to do that to make predictive policing more just. Lastly, the negative could take a more radical, critical approach around the prison industrial complex. So the prison industrial complex is an adaptation of the phrase that President Dwight Eisenhower used to refer to the military industrial complex, or the revolving door between business and a bloated military budget. The prison industrial complex has been used by scholars in a variety of different social movements and within now academia to talk about the extent that business and the state have conspired together to produce a profoundly unequal system along lines of race and class, where, for instance, private prisons make money by filling beds and have lobbied against reforms to reduce over incarceration because it affects their bottom line. And in the same way, you could argue that the entire system is bankrupt, and that just focusing on a sliver of that in terms of the role of big data in policing totally overlooks all of the larger structural violence that occurs to uphold that system. And that's especially an effective position if the affirmative argues that ordinary methods of policing and criminal justice are legitimate, but that predictive policing uniquely is not. Which is also why the affirmative should make sure that they don't necessarily make a hedging claim like that, hedging against negative claims about, like public safety and crime by arguing, well, the way things were done before was awesome, but then these predictions with big data came along and it, made policing super ineffective and biased. I think the affirmative definitely wants to toe the line between falling to a critique that they're upholding an unjust system, while at the same time, being able to challenge, certain, statements from the negative about a total inability to deal with crimes that are legitimately occurring and problematic unless we have predictive policing. So there are a lot of really unique and complex questions that this topic can engage with, even though it is a short resolution. And again, I'm really glad I was able to give this topic analysis for you once again. I am Adam Tomasi with Champion Briefs, and definitely check out our evidence brief, which has hundreds of cards on both sides that talk about all of these questions that this topic analysis engages with, especially the articles that I was referring to, where you have some really sweet cards that you can draw from us. So thank you, and I hope you have a great topic.